Welcome again, everybody, to our second discussion of A Dance to the Music of Time for 2025. This month, we're going to be talking about the second volume in the series, A Buyer's Market, which in some ways, in my mind, it's in some ways, for me, rereading it, it's sort of the volume I remember best as kind of what I associate with Powell, and it may be because of the significant uh, centering of much of the book around this evening of three parties or three events. Um, so I'll just start out with a couple of slides here. So volume two came out in quite soon after volume one, Question of Ukraine. We've moved forward a couple of years. So Nick and his former classmates at the fictional version of Eton are now out in the world, starting getting their foothold in various ways. This is also, it's interesting, Hilary Sperling dates this as either summer of 28 or 29. What's obvious is what hasn't happened is the great market crashes of October 29. So this is essentially just before the Depression. We're hoping that Nick Burns will be joining us. Nick is one of the world's great experts on Anthony Powell, and has, I would highly recommend his book published by the University of South Carolina Press, Understanding Anthony Powell, in part because unlike a lot of analyses that you see, critical academic works on authors' works, this one is comprehensive. So it's not just a dance to the music of time, although that's a significant part of it, but also it includes his early novels, it includes his journals, it includes his memoirs and his dramas. So it's essentially a comprehensive look at Powell's oeuvre. And that's particularly interesting. I'm reading his memoirs in parallel with that, and you do see so many links among and across the works that Powell has done. Next month, we're hoping to have another special guest, Wesley Stace. Some of you know Wes from the class that he taught during the lockdown about A Dance to the Music of Time, and he's such an enthusiast. He was happy to join us for next month's discussion. And with that, obviously, if you have questions, you can contact me through the email editor at musicoftime.com. Hopefully, you're all getting the emails through the mailing list. We have about 185 subscribers to the list right now. So it looks like folks are very interested in that. And with that, I'll stop this. And while we're waiting for Nick Burns to join us, I just a couple of thoughts that I wanted to offer to kind of stimulate the discussion. Rereading Powell, one of the things that really has struck me is the tentativeness of much of his language, or his language is channeled through Nicholas Jenkins. And so the nice thing about having access to an electronic version of the text is you can do word searches and quickly confirm sorts of things. But one of the things that I found is very often the kind of guidance that's given to writers in writers programs, and you see it in just about any basic text about good writing, is to avoid what you might call as qualifiers, vague qualifiers like very. One of a basic piece of advice given to writers is to essentially delete all your varies because they're relatively empty words. So I did a search on the first couple of volumes, and Powell uses 90 somethings in A Question of Upbringing and 93 in A Buyer's Market. He used 113 rathers in A Question of Upbringing, 242 rathers in A Buyer's Market. And, it's sort of like in some ways for me it can be a little bit frustrating to see this sort of tentativeness, and yet it seems to be sort of a distinguishing characteristic throughout the series is this reluctance to make hard and fast conclusions about any characters. And I don't know, I just wanted to ask if anybody else had either positive or negative reactions to that sort of tentative character of Powell's language. Anyone? John?
I think of Powell in jazz terms, he's vamping quite a lot. There are these little pauses in between phrases and descriptions of what's going on. That at least we knew to be true, you know. There's just like these little ways of stepping back from the action or letting it just kind of roll on after something really precise and vivid and funny, or different combinations of that, has happened. So I don't think it's as tentativeness. I think it's a certain coolness in the way he approaches the storytelling.
I see a couple of hands raised. I think John Gould was first, and then Frank.
I would say that the tentativeness occurs because he's very hesitant to ascribe motives to other characters. He doesn't want you to think that because he says a character is X, that the character is such. And that kind of diffidence is, I found, always kind of nice for a first person narrator, not to say X is X, but X is rather X.
Okay. Frank, and then we'll get to Bergmeyer.
I don't think that Nick is aware of a lot of things that are going on around him. So, for example, with Deacon, he's maybe not aware that he's a homosexual and that he had to escape to France to avoid prosecution, or what some of the relationships are between people. He seems to always refer things back to, like, people are described as being like Uncle Giles, a lot of people, or being a lot like Stringham or Templar. And he seems to be trying to work out the world around him via the things that he knows.
Right, right. John Bergmeyer?
Yeah, another John. Yeah, I mean, similarly, he's constantly saying that his first impression or his understanding of someone was wrong. Like Widmerpool or someone, he's always, constantly saying, "Oh, I didn't realize this, I didn't realize that." So, that sort of plays into, perhaps why he's hesitant, because he's seems to misjudge people quite a bit.
Well, it's interesting, Frank, the comment about Mr. Deacon in particular, because later on in the series, we get a much clearer picture that Nick does recognize his homosexuality. So it raises a question in my mind is where is Nick when he's relating these things? Is it essentially sitting down, if you will, and writing this all out as some memoir? Or is it essentially dipping in at multiple periods? Because there's a perfect example where essentially later on he has a richer understanding of a character than he has in the first volume. I don't know, Frank, you want to follow up on that?
Or is it that that he's now able to, culture has changed to the point where Anthony Powell can now write about a character being a homosexual, and perhaps originally when it was published that wasn't going to be acceptable?
Interesting. I don't know the timelines and the legal aspects of things. It's certainly before um, the legalization and the or elimination of the legal constraints in this, which was in the early 60s, I believe. But let's see, Leslie, if you can go off mute. Leslie, oh, there you are. Great.
Yeah, I can probably bore for Europe on the implications about homosexuality. And I think this is about the period when people are beginning to subtly introduce issues around homosexuality. And it's very much an observer's view in this book. It's not kind of the first person
Right.
experience. But that wasn't what I was going to say. I was going to say I actually managed to dig out the emails from an online discussion group that I participated in the late 90s about Dance the Music of Time. And thinking about, and I some of these are, they're a bit kind of haphazard, and a lot of them are in response to other people. And there was a point where my ISP was getting very odd, so there are massive gaps because I was missing things. But I thought this was actually relevant to this idea about the indeterminacy of the view that's going on. It's not so much about the language, but I said the picture at the opening of a buyer's market of the objects brought together in an auction room and the patterns made by their random juxtaposition and the meanings they gained from that conjunction, and the random associations and collisions of the characters apparently produce the narrative after that, but perhaps only from the point of view of the actual observer. He's actually making the narrative out of these conjunctions of the people who are, appearing before him. Or is he, I said then, I think this is actually a bit pretentious, Heisenberg-like, is the observer actually influencing the action? I'm not sure about that. I think that's a bit like Ponzi.
Keith, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I agree with Leslie about the gradual opening up of the ability to discuss homosexuality and so on. It was sort of there when I was a student in the late 60s, but it wasn't hugely much talked about, but one was much more aware. And remember that Powell is having to be very careful what he writes at this date, because we're 10 years, give or take, before the Lady Chatterley trial, which
Right.
loosened up the obscenity laws, which was 59, 60 from memory. And it's noticeable that in the later volumes, Powell does become more liberal with his descriptive language of sort of sexuality. Not a lot, because he doesn't see, he doesn't see it as necessary, but he does become a bit looser. The other thing I'd add, I think in response to Frank, is that what Powell is doing, what Nick Jenkins is doing in my view, in all these books, is looking back. He's writing these books as if they were, and Powell says this somewhere, a series of stories told over the dinner table. So he's sort of looking at it perhaps in terms of, at this date, maybe he's in his 50s, 60s, he's talking to people over the dinner table, and he's looking back and saying, well, it was only later that I actually realized that, Deacon was a homosexual or whatever. Looking back, I suppose I had a vague inclination, but so his sort of indeterminate language is almost deliberate in that sense. I don't find it a problem. I accept it as Powell's style, and it doesn't worry me. But I think that's possibly where he's coming from.
I'm not
Remembering he's
a
writing
problem,
this.
but it's clearly characteristic of his style. There are certain phrases like something rather very perhaps that occur far more frequently in Powell's prose than I would say. I mean, if you were to use the sample of like Waugh or other contemporaries, I really doubt that you would find it those kind of tentative words as prevalent as they are here. And I went through five volumes, and it stays fairly consistent. Paul Milliken, you had wanted to chime in?
Yeah. So on the style of writing, somebody, I can't remember who, said it's so hypnotic that after finishing a Powell novel, I find it actually quite difficult to turn to anything else. Because it's so distinctive. It is reflective, as Keith has said, but I think is also part of AP's philosophy, where he says a number of times, nobody really knows what goes on inside people's heads or in their relationships or in their marriages or whatever. So necessarily, judgments about people, even those you are quite close to, have to be quite tentative and hedged around, because it's a mistake to feel that you do know what's going on. I think the other point about, and actually, but it is easy to parody it. And sometimes, like in the Fisher King, for example, if you read the beginning of the Fisher King, his last novel, the first 2 or 3 pages almost come close to self-parody in the hesitations and equivocations that he uses there. But I think the other powerful thing about his style is that he can interrupt that with very pithy statements. So I don't know if you remember in the Buyer's Market, the point where he comes across Widmerpool, who's in some distress, and he wonders why Widmerpool's in some distress, and Widmerpool just says, "A doctor was found."
Right.
Now that one phrase, 4 words, "a doctor was found," basically conveys a whole situation and a history, and puts Widmerpool in a completely different light for Jenkins. He's once appalled by the situation Widmerpool has got himself into, and then on reflection is actually then slightly amazed at Widmerpool actually getting himself into that kind of situation, because he's actually written him off effectively as very ineffectual in that department. So Powell can shift gears very effectively, I think, between that rather hypnotic style and the more pithy style often he uses in his conversational statements. Thank you.
Yeah. Keith, you had something you wanted to add?
2 things, actually. One is Powell actually says somewhere, I'm not sure, I think it's probably in his journals or memoirs. I don't think it's in, I don't know, maybe it is. But, he actually says what we all know, and that is, you can never fully understand anybody else's marriage, anybody else's actual relationship. I mean, I would say, even down to, friends. You can never fully understand from the outside. That's one thing. The other thing is, I'm going to throw a little sort of wrench into the narrative in Paul, having brought up the question of Widmerpool and the doctor being found. There is a general assumption, I think, amongst a lot of readers, not all readers, a lot of readers, that Widmerpool has got Gypsy into trouble. I don't think he has. I think Gypsy actually is very acute and sees him as a means of getting the money to find a doctor. Because if you remember, Deacon says at Millie Andriadis's party that Gypsy is in trouble. He actually makes that comment, and I think a lot of people don't sort of pick that up. But it's, to me, and I know we've had this discussion before within society in various groups, but for me, I don't think Widmer Paul is the culprit. He's the fall guy.
Keith, I think you're right. That's my reading of it as well. But of course, Jenkins has to take it at face value at the time.
Yeah, I would agree. That was my impression as well. But we have several folks who want to chime in. I think Sally was first, and then Leslie.
Okay, yeah, I totally agree. At first I did think that Widmer Pool was the culprit. However, when I reread the party at Millie's, when Gypsy runs off into the night to go to the nightclub, and Widmer Pool, where did Gypsy go? She was just telling me something. It is Gypsy, right? Anyway, that she was just telling me something that she's really upset about. And she didn't just run out in the night by herself to a nightclub, did she? And so that's when I kind of realized that she was actually telling Widmer Pool that she was in trouble. And he, as Keith said, he became the fall guy, and he ended up paying a lot of money for the doctor, which he didn't have.
Right. Leslie?
And of course, remember at this date that abortion is still illegal.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I was going to say was, in fact, Deacon says to Jenkins, do you know a doctor who does not have these narrow views of the average GP? I don't think he actually says to him, Gypsy's in trouble, but after Gypsy has run out, he says to him, assuming that as a young man about town, he might know doctors who will do this. And yes, abortion is illegal at this time, but this is another subject I can bore for Europe about, is that although it was illegal, quite apart from the fact there was a massive trade in abortion pills and backstreet abortions, if you knew the right people, there was a ongoing trade in Harley Street abortions. There were doctors who were prepared to do it for comfortable sums of money, and you find this a lot in the novels of the time of the 20s and well, not so much the 20s, novels of the 30s, Rosamund Behrman and so on. If you had £100 in the name of a certain doctor, it was possible to get an abortion under hygienic, surgical conditions. Right. Which is probably what Widmer Pool is coughing up for.
Okay, we have Nick Burns has joined us, but Richard, you had your hand up, and we'll get your comment and then Nick join the discussion.
Just a quick comment. It seems that years later, Nick is commenting on the fact that he's peeling these layers away from these people who he met in school. And then discovering new things about them that he was not expecting. And then people we only meet in this novel, like Barbara, he's like, wait, he married who? She married who? And he kind of cared, but he didn't really care. And so I think that's his perspective now, that he's like looking back on this and like, well, I thought at this time. And so each successive encounter he has with these people, he finds out more, like Mr. Dean. And the funniest one is that he admits that he had no idea what Windermore's Christian name was, and then we only find out toward the end of this book from his mother. I just kind of laughed out loud at that, because he kind of set that up and then just throws it in there. Never mind.
Yeah. Let me invite Nick Burns, who joined us. I think Nick, I think, and this is for everybody. I have noticed that Gmail, but also many other email systems, particularly institutional email systems, tend to be suspicious of what I might call novel email addresses. So if you're not getting the updates, and there are not a lot of things that I do send out. I tend to send out the introduction for the month and then a collection of reviews and then the Zoom invitation. If you're not getting those, please check your spam folders because it tends to get flagged as spam for whatever reason. And I'm a Gmail user myself, and I find that sometimes I don't even get my own emails under my other addresses. But with that, let me introduce Professor Nick Burns, who is the author of Understanding Anthony Powell, and he graciously agreed to join us and offer a few thoughts on both this particular volume in the series and the series as a whole. So Nick, over to you. If you could unmute, though.
Brad, can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, Brad. March 3rd has long been marked as an auspicious day on my calendar, and I'm glad to have it arrive. That remark that Richard just made about who Barbara marries, and before I get to my general remarks, I want to talk about that because it's so interesting. It's almost like an Agatha Christie mystery if you read it in retrospect. When you read it the first time, you're astonished by who did it, and then when you read it again, you see the pattern being laid there. Because we meet Barbara and we meet at the Hunter Comes Ball, and we have these three young men in love with her. Nick, who has been pursuing her for several months. Poole, who it turns out has known her. His father supplied liquid manure to Lord Goring's estate up in Nottinghamshire, and Poole has long aspired to marry her. And then we have Thompson, who is Sir Gavin's protege. Rough around the edges, but Sir Gavin kind of believes in the new men and their potential. And there's a kind of, to use the American political usage, there's a kind of primary for the hand of Barbara Goring. And we think, well, these are the three candidates. And when we're at that occasion where Nick learns Kenneth Poole's Christian name, and it is revealed from Janet Wolfe Wilson who Barbara has married, we know it's not Nick, we know it's not Kenneth, and we think it's Thompson because that's the only other person in the Barbara Goring primary. But it turns out to be Pardo, and we think, well, we were astonished. And then we look back and we look at the dance, and you see when she infamously pours the sugar on Poole that she's about to go and talk about horse racing with Pardo. And we see that the writer has laid the groundwork, that Powell has laid the groundwork for her affinity for Pardo. So if the reader goes back, we see it. But if we're reading it for the first time, we don't notice Pardo at all. We don't see him as an entrant in that contest. And that's just the subtlety with which this novel is organized. Last month, you had a great discussion of question of upbringing. I just want to follow up on a couple of points. You discussed how each novel tells a story in itself, but also each novel is an element in what Brad called a larger tapestry, which, as you noted, he didn't know was 12 volumes yet. He was just unfolding it. Then we have Buyer's Market. And just as in the first installment, the narrative begins in a flashback, and the narrator is seeing Mr. Deacon's painting at an auction. And then we have 3 pages of ruminative prose. And then we have that flashback of how the narrator knows Mr. Deacon, his friendship with the narrator's parents, their meeting at the Louvre during the Versailles Peace Conference. Versailles was just one of the treaties, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. All of this is rather slow. And we discussed last time, the reader of the first volume, it feels somewhat of an element of slowness. We feel a bit bogged down. And then suddenly it just speeds up. And we have this incredibly rapid story. and were put into the cauldron of modern London. And this becomes a novel of the modern city, which is kind of restaging all those traditional 19th century novels of young men making their way into the city, updating it in jazzy, frenetic 20th century terms. And it's an incredible sequence. The Night of the Three Parties, it's bravura, it's joltingly fast. As soon as we see that segue from Memories of Mr. Deacon to the hanging of the painting in the Walpole Wilson's dining room, and it becomes this epic exploration of the three pillars of the social scene of dance to the music of time: the aristocracy, the world of Bohemia, and the world of business. You know, Lord Huntercombe, Barnby, and Sir Magnus may be represented here. And Heath commented last time there are a lot of characters that are introduced in the first volume but are not used later, like Valkeapaa or Honthorst. Monsieur Dubuisson does not recur. Pohl in the 1989 diary entry says maybe I had intended Monsieur Dubuisson to be a free French person in the Second World War. He doesn't do any of that. But in this novel, everybody introduced ends up recurring, even if only in a very minor way, like Archie Gilbert or Margaret Budd. I just want to close my opening remarks, which ended up being in the middle of the hour. I want to call particular attention to two characters. I don't know if you've discussed them yet. I came in on discussing the Gypsy's abortion. But Mr. Deacon and Sir Gavin Walpole Wilson. And both are friends of Jenkins' parents, and both are people who are kind of transitional figures between his young world and his adult world. I inherited a number of friends of both my parents, so I kind of understand that. I think we've all been there. That these are figures, they're not his boss. They're not his boss. They're not his father. They're not his superior at work, but they are adults, and they bring him into contact with interesting people. They're not exemplars to be emulated, but neither are they preposterous posers to be ribbed. Proust would have done the first, Evelyn Waugh the second. Pohl kind of takes them as they are and sees what is interesting about them. And of course, he meets Barnby and Gypsy, both of whom turn out to be important to him in very different ways, through Mr. Deacon. And he meets Barbara Goring through Sir Gavin. And he values, even though Mr. Deacon is a bad painter, he values Mr. Deacon's aesthetic interests and his interest in the 1890s. And even though Sir Gavin is a failed diplomat, his stances, the narrative does not disagree with his stances on international affairs. When he says, I have this fundamental affinity with Caroli or Sforza, those were moderate, middle of the road, non-fascist, moderate conservatives. And that's kind of where the political heart of the narrative is. So those people have values that are not spurned. They're made fun of. Mr. Deacon, his aversion to the Royal Academy, and Sir Gavin saying, through lust of knowing what we should not know, we take the golden road to Samarkand. But they're not rejected. They're seen as interesting. And that's indicative of the way the sequence really handles people, especially in what we read for today. We meet all sorts of people, and the narrator takes them in and kind of reserves judgment. And so with that, I'm interested in what characters of all the gallery we meet. We meet so many. I mean, on the email list, some of you were talking about who's a major character, who's a minor character in dance. What characters interested people the most? What grabbed people's attention the most? Or who?
I just want
Yes, and it is
chime
pronounced
in with
Pohl.
one.
Somebody in the chat said, is it pronounced Pohl? It is pronounced Pohl, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Americans would say Powell, but yeah, it's Pohl. I just want to offer one comment, because one of the things I asked Nick to focus on, because to me it's very interesting. If you're a writer who is taking on a book length project, or in this case a multi-book length project, I believe it's impossible to engage in that without having constant questions about structure, and particularly about where you place things and how do you place them in respect to each other. And in his memoirs, I find this is sort of an interesting comment. In Pohl's memoir, very early on, he mentions a character named Tom Balston,
Mhm.
who was an associate of his father's in the army, who ends up later on helping Pohl in his career. And he says, and this is in the first chapter of his memoir, the first volume. Tom Balston's early arrival in these memoirs raises a question of how best to deal with such recurrent figures. Are they just to be mentioned, then picked up again in a later volume, like the unfolding of a novel's plot or the second act of a play? Alternatively, is it better to anticipate the writer's personal narrative and briefly summarize his lifetime relations with those making an early appearance? There is something to be said for and against both methods. A mixed chronology is perhaps preferable, each case treated on its own merit. And that,
Mhm.
to me, it's sort of like it opened up, it shows that even after having written The Dance, he was still tossing over these questions about how do you, and he obviously knew that this was only going to be, he wasn't going to try to write a one volume memoir.
Exactly. So
Uh,
when to play your cards, and it's especially relevant. First of all, Tom Balston is probably the original for Daniel Tokenhouse, who's a character in Dance, who is a character that it is revealed Nicholas Jenkins is working for at this point, and the era where he goes to the Hunterton's Ball, but who is not actually introduced until much later. And only in the 11th book is it revealed that his boss at the publishing house that we know he works for is Daniel Tokenhouse. And so Pohl delays deploying a lot of people who the narrator, in fact, knows. He knows all the musical people we meet in the 5th book in Casanova's Chinese Restaurant. He already knows them by this point. But for narrative purposes, he only wants to play a certain amount of his cards. In the memoir, of course, the memoir form is different and you can do it more consecutively. You don't want to have so many flashbacks in a memoir, but you have this issue where, again, it's this friend of his father's. He's known him since childhood, but he had a different relation to him as an adult, such as is true with Sir Gavin and Mr. Deacon in this.
Right.
How do you handle it? How do you do the back and forth? And for Pohl, probably any method is going to involve a sacrifice, but he has to choose the most productive and know he's going to give up something.
Yeah.
Yes, Keith?
At risk of being out of place, I'm going to take us off in a different direction, different strand, but brought on by Nick mentioning Balston, Tokenhouse, and indeed Deacon. And one of the things that struck me reading Buyer's Market this time is just the number of artists that are name dropped in there. Just as much as novelists and writers. And of course, AP was very knowledgeable about art history and about art. I mean, I picked just two little scenes. First of all, Jenkins walking back into Shepherd Market in the small hours of the morning after Mrs. Andreadis's party, and secondly, his discussion with Quiggin at Mr. Deacon's birthday party. And in just those two short scenes, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, at least 8 artists name dropped. No, Puvis de Chavannes, Simeon Solomon, Canaletto, Piranesi, Lipschitz, Zadkine, Epstein, and Powell, as I say, is sufficiently knowledgeable about art that, you know, this again is if you like, a sort of recurrent sub theme right through the series.
Definitely.
In the way that he often sort of talks about particular writers.
Definitely, and of course, in the last book, a particular painting appears very movingly, and you'll discover that in about 10 months or so, those of you who are reading the sequence for the first time. But Puvita Sivan and Simeon Solomon are mentioned in apposition to Mr. Deacon, and they're there to delineate the kind of painter he aspired to be. But the rest of the painters are, yes, people are compared to them. They're mentioned to illuminate people's character. They look like a portrait. It looks like a Piranesi. That looks like a Piranesi prison. And the reader who does not know those painters will have to fill that in. The reader who does is very much enriched. And of course, this is called Dance to the Music of Time. And even though they're dancers and musicians, the visual arts, as Keith said, are much more fundamentally important. And of course, Dance to the Music of Time is a painting by Nicolas Poussin. The entire sequence is named after a painting, although a painting that represents music and dance.
Yeah, I just want to eject. I mean, I don't think anybody could read this series, and really by the second book, for sure. These are not just like lingua franca references to artists and their work. I mean, even somebody who's relatively well versed and knowledgeable of art is going to come across references that you'll have to look up. So it shows that Powell through Jenkins, I mean, really had a rich and deep understanding of a broad range of artists and of art history. So we have John Bergmeyer and Paul and Keith. So let me take it in that order.
Sure, yeah, I think part of this is, Nicholas, a discussion we were having before you joined about like the hesitancy and sort of like getting characters wrong. And since you had mentioned the various minor characters, or maybe they're not going to be minor. This is my first time reading, so to be determined, I guess, if they're minor.
Exactly.
Was Quiggin. I found it just very interesting that, you know, when we meet him, he is this diligent. He's portrayed as this hardworking person who sort of like looks down at the idleness of university life, and then we just like it's referenced when we encounter him towards the end of this volume that he was apparently sent down from university for idleness, which I just found. I mean, do you have any just sort of insight into sort of that like sort of disconnect between how we met him and then just finding that he was apparently too lazy to stay in school?
Yeah. Well, with Quiggin, he might have been more interested in working the scene and making connections than actually doing the academic work. And I think at the Oxford of that era, the academic work scene is only one scene. And there's a social scene and a political scene, and there are other scenes. And very often, and this was true, F. Scott Fitzgerald, famous for going to Princeton, did not graduate from Princeton. And you didn't necessarily have to graduate from these places or do academically well to profit from them. And I think it's different today, where there's an expectation that you will actually do academically well at one of these places if you want to associate their name with yours. But I can see the consistency there. And I think he was working very hard at his left-wing political career and his writing and publishing career, but not necessarily working within the strict academic canons of the university.
Yeah, I just would interject, if you look, and you can see this in Powell's own career, particularly after the war, he was working like a dog, pushing out weekly articles. And it is amazing if you look at the newspapers and the journals of that time, their typical book reviewers weren't reviewing a book. Their typical book reviewers were reviewing 6 books. It was not at all used. And if you think about that grind, what a grind it would have been to, number one, read them and then get through and come up with something intelligent to say about them. on a week in, week out basis. So yeah, it's clear to me that Quiggin essentially just says, screw classes. You know,
Right.
I'm publishing journalism, and that's what I need to do. So I've effectively graduated. We have a number of folks want to, so I think it's Paul, Keith, and then Richard.
Yeah, I just want to come back to the artist's point. It's interesting that we've talked about Nick Jenkins' voice in the novels as one which has lots of qualifications about things, not very definite about anything. He's quite reflective. He doesn't make judgments at all. Complete contrast to the artists, typically in the books. You may remember Deakin talks with, quote, spoke with great bitterness of the Royal Academy. And you can just imagine a painter of his type declaiming all sorts of things about the Royal Academy. Barmby, of course, very pungent with his observations about life. Women always overplay their hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And take Gypsy Jones, completely, utterly incapable of thought. I mean, she's been educated in the typical middle class way, head stuffed full of things. She just can't think at all. I mean, he's very definite in his opinions. So the sort of the artists that are portrayed are a complete contrast to the kind of tone of voice that Nick Jenkins uses throughout the novel, and I think that's a nice contrast in a bit of salt and pepper as you read through the novels.
Exactly. And Mr. Deakin is very opinionated. His quarrel with Max Pilgrim. And also, it's made very clear Barmby does not think much of Deakin as a painter. And yeah, that is, if everybody was as non-judgmental as Jenkins, it would be a very boring book. That Jenkins is non-judgmental about people who are themselves judgmental. Most other people in the book are judgmental in various ways. I'm not sure I would agree that Gypsy Jones has no thought. She's not an original thinker, but in the whole War Never Pays saga, it's made very clear that although Deakin and Jones are selling the paper together, they are very different motives for being pacifists. Where Deakin is the traditional kind of late Victorian, almost Tolstoyan pacifist, whereas Gypsy Jones is pacifist because she's a party line supporter of the Soviet Union and is tactically pacifist. And that it's made very clear they have a political difference. And Gypsy at least has, it's not to my mind a congenial philosophy, but she does have a philosophy of life. And she puts herself in with all these left-wing dudes, with Quiggin and Craggs, etc., because of those ideas.
I agree with you, but I think it tells us more about Barmby and his attitude to women.
Barmby's judgment.
So Barmby sees them basically as models.
Exactly. And Barmby, interestingly, does not see in Gypsy what Nick ends up seeing in her.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Keith?
I'm going to some extent, pick up on that painter's question. And a comment that Guy has made in the chat. The fact that you don't know who all these painters are when you read it, I don't think matters particularly. There is a lot of stuff in dance that you can't define properly. You probably don't really know. You know, what is a regiment of the line? And that gets mentioned somewhere in the buyer's market. Who knows what a regiment of the line actually is? Very few of us probably. And certainly where we've had discussions with translators over the years, and there have been 2 or 3 that we've had interaction with, almost invariably they come back to us and say, what is a regiment of the line? And it's something you don't actually maybe know. You've got a vague idea of it, some particular sort of regiment in the army, but it doesn't matter. You just read over it. And there's a lot of stuff like that. You know, I mean, there's one that crops up a bit later, which I'll probably talk about, you know, trotting races. What are trotting races? Now, a lot of Americans probably do know, because I think it's still something in America, but it is not something a lot of Brits know.
That's interesting.
You know, and there are an awful lot of things like this that you just sort of read over. You've got the general idea, and that's enough.
Yeah. That's
I just
interesting about
want to, we'll get Richard, but I just want to sort of disagree in the sense that that you can go over it the first time through any book. Most people are reading for plot anyway, and they're going to quickly hit a wall because they're going to realize that's actually not what Pole's about. It's about, you know, interactions and conversations and characterizations and things like that. But with any text, the more you understand what the references are, it's a richer text. It just is. That's why people spend their lives studying Shakespeare, because you can keep digging and digging and digging. So I would say yes, the first time through, if you stumble across every artist name and reference, it's going to be a long slog. But rereading it, one wants to know what these references are for sure. Richard.
Yeah, going back to the point of what characters are fascinating you, Jean, it's just fascinating how she just crops up for like a little bit in the first, a little bit in the second. It's like a teaser trailer. And obviously she's going to be a big character. Now, this is the first time I'm reading through the series. I read the first book like years ago, but then I reread it. And then now that I've read the second book for the first time, he goes back and say, well, you know, years later when Gene and I were playing whatever it's like Russian billiards, sounds like pinball. Like, okay, but she's married to DuPont now. And then he's like, goes to call and they're away. And how is this going to, how are they going to get together? I guess it's like the old rom-com thing.
Don't let's spoil it for Richard.
No, please don't. Although I did read the first chapter of the third book, so I'm kind of seeing how that's going to play down. But yeah, it's just, I mean, Gene is just, it's just wonderful the way he just kind of, oh, there she is, like, oh, I remember you. Yeah, and he's like, oh, hey. Yeah, but she's married. Well, but maybe not that married. I mean, oh, she's having a child. Well, I guess, I mean, she's really, well, and then and then, you know, like, okay, then I've got like 55 other things to deal with. And no, I just love that.
Yeah, well said. And I think that Jean, that very last page when Jean is mentioned, and we only met her at Stourwater briefly, of course. He was in her house, or her and Duport's house, because Millie Andriatis was renting her Hill Street pied-à-terre from the Duports. But yes, that's a little bit of indication that she's not just part of his past, because he met her visiting her brother's family in the first book, but part of his future.
Leslie?
I was thinking about this thing about these references, and sometimes you can just make out enough about them from context that you don't need to go any further, but they are very acute. They tell you, I mean, the more you think about them, and if you know about them, they say something, they place people or they place situations very specifically, you know, for class or time, for period. And I mean, one thing I absolutely loved, because it's an absolute thing of mine, was where Barmby says of Gypsy Jones, she's the toast of the 1917 club. And the 1917 club was this rather raffish left-wing club in Soho, which was the hangout of all the left-wing people throughout, from sort of the 1910s through the 1920s to 1930s. And actually it was very mixed. It included people who became the Labour government in 1945, as well as some really kind of bohemian people. But it's very on point for Gypsy Jones and the kind of, you know, set she runs with. But all these other things like the trotting races, I think that's probably, I mean, I don't know enough about it, but I think that's probably an indicator of a certain type of person, because the critic James Agate was very into trotting races. He was a major cultural figure in the 1930s. He wrote the Ego column and which was published in books as collected as volumes. And he talks a lot about trotting horses. So it was obviously a thing at the time, and I think it probably had certain kind of connotations that you could tell, that kind of ramified. And so it actually told you a lot about people and about certain social situations if you invoke that.
Right, right.
So I think that's probably, I mean, I feel that's going on a lot with the things that Powell mentions, very passingly, very fleetingly, doesn't make a big point of them, doesn't hammer them home, but it's it's kind of setting something in train.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
kind of hinting something. It's just a little, it's like putting a tiny dab of a very subtle spice.
John Gould, if you can unmute.
Yes, there. This is a complete shift, and you can dismiss it, but it's a present to everybody here. Some of you know that I twice taught a year-long course at Phillips Academy in Andover on the entire dance series, all 12 novels, to seniors. And one of the kids wrote a haiku, Japanese poem, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, for this book. And it begins, I'm going to read it to you, and then you can just do what you want to with it. Banana in eyes, Widmerpool's face is slavish. Now it's Barbara's turn. And nobody has mentioned Barbara's great act with the sugar caster, where Widmerpool got to be slavish again. So anyway, I hope it's okay.
No, absolutely. I think we'll see as the series goes on, Widmerpool and essentially the deviousness of his slavishness becomes much clearer to Nick, and obviously through Nick to us as readers. Keith?
Just to pick up very briefly on what Leslie was saying, all these little throwaway lines that Paul puts in, 1917 Club and things like that, it's almost all genuine. He's picked it up from somewhere. If he hasn't experienced it, he's heard about it. And all these little throwaway lines, it's good stuff. And there's probably a story behind every one of them. When we get there, I'll tell you about the one I know about and I've researched.
Just to mention on the question of the pictures, there is a link on the Music of Time homepage to another site called Pictures in Powell, where it's essentially a blog that's gone through and highlighted quite a number. It's not comprehensive, but quite a lot of the artistic references that
the society now. The society now owns Pictures in Powell. We've taken it over from the original, creators, one of whom is terminally ill, if indeed he's still on life. So yeah, I mean, we took that over about 6 months ago, and we haven't done anything with it yet, but it's in plan that we will do something with it, and right. If only to memorialize Rosenbaum and Pelzer. It's a good resource.
Yes, it is. Colin, you
excuse me. Hi, just before we go, I'd like to just catch the last page with reference to the Russian billiards affair, when he's playing Russian billiards with Jean. It's a long time since I played Russian billiards, but my recollection is it's a smaller table than a billiard table, and that you put money in the machine, the balls come onto the bays, and you play for a certain period of time. Then as Poe remark, or as Nick remarks, at some point the bar comes down and stops the balls returning, and eventually then you tot up your score at the end when all the balls have gone. And he makes the point that I suppose it's just the way he finishes off the book, that he says, this is perhaps an image of how we live, for reasons not always at the time explicable. There are specific occasions when events begin suddenly to take on a significance previously unsuspected, so that before we really know where we are, life seems to have begun in earnest at last, and we ourselves scarcely aware that any change has taken place, are careering uncontrollably down the slippery slopes, slippery avenues of eternity. At the age of 23, 24, that's how I felt. Suddenly, you were aware that you were alive. And I suppose just to mention that I found that resonated quite clearly with me.
Sounds like foosball.
It's
I don't know
not
if- I don't know if they
dissimilar
call it
to
foosball
in
in England,
America. You know, a lot of bars used to. I don't know if they now, because I don't go to bars much, but it used to be that pool table. If it wasn't a pool hall and they just had like one pool table or two, they were coin operated. You like paid 50 cents and it allowed you to run the balls, but then they wouldn't come back out, so you couldn't like play endlessly.
Yeah, that's the way that the tables operated.
Yeah.
I don't mean to fixate on one little detail of the whole novel, but still, that just sounded really weird.
Keith, you had another comment?
Let's pick up on John's point about with his haiku. We have not talked about possibly the big set piece, pièce de résistance of the novel, and indeed I would suggest perhaps one of the whole series, and that's Widmerpool being doused in sugar. I can quite imagine. I mean, it's a wonderful scene for Powell to have written, and I can quite imagine he actually saw it done somewhere, or was told about it being done to somebody. It really is. I don't know. I can't really explain it, but it is just one of the big. Whenever you end up talking to people about dance, it's one of the big things that people tend to remember. It's one of the key scenes, and yeah, I mean it illuminates all sorts of things.
Frank, you had a comment?
I think it's because it's so reflective of Widmerpool's character, in that he has this embarrassing situation in front of all his friends, but doesn't acknowledge that it's an embarrassing situation. He tries to style it out and make out that it's nothing to be embarrassed about. And I think that is a lot of Widmerpool's attitude, is not to be seen to be in a low position in any way.
Right.
Yeah. Or to disclose any vulnerability. At the Grow Your Club, we had a little skit that Ed Bach wrote about the scene, the transition from the Hunter Comes Fall to the Andriatis party. And I played Widmerpool. And I thought about how to play him, and that doggedness and that refusal to admit any vulnerability, and that showing that exteriority, and not showing that being wounded by something that even Nick Jenkins thinks. I mean, he thinks much less of Barbara after she does it. And as hilarious as it is, it's the funniest scene in the novel. And Widmerpool just should affect him in some way. It's only human, and yet he won't show. He doesn't want to show that vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, you mentioned you remind you of Piggy. Is that Piggy in Lord of the Flies? Okay, yeah. I mean, body wise, I certainly saw Widmerpool as Piggy-like, a little bit chunky, the glasses wearing. But yeah, over the course of time we discover, and it's interesting in the context of some things we see going on in a real world today, that, that narcissists, I mean, what Whitmore recognizes, I think we start to understand as we see through multiple volumes, is he knows how to manipulate people. And particularly, there are a lot of people in this book who are, I wouldn't say are narcissists, but they're self-centered. They see the world, and essentially the world becomes very vague outside their immediate sphere of contact. And he knows how to play to people like that, like Sir Magnus and others, to get them to allow him to do something he wants to do. And over the course of time, he becomes much more skilled at that.
Mm-hmm. And you
Colin,
see
we're after the hour, so we'll wrap up pretty quickly here. But Colin, you had your hand raised.
I'll make it quick. Just the point that I think it's where Nick meets Widmerpool and he remembers that Widmerpool used to knock a golf ball into a net down in Barnes some way. And Widmerpool acknowledges that. And Nick reflects that he at no point did he understand that Nick was, if you like, moving onto his territory and really deeply engaging with him, because Widmerpool, being the narcissist that he is, thought that everybody should naturally be only interested in his life. And personally, I found that when all the narcissists I've come across, and in academia you meet quite a lot of them, they were all like that.
Any last comments that folks want to make? This has been a terrific discussion, and
thank you, Brad.
But yes, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just briefly explain in Powell's defense, and he said it was an affectation to pronounce the name that way. His grounds for it were in that Powell is really a patronymic, because in Welsh, and putting this into chat, ap is the patronymic particle. So for instance, Pritchard, the name Pritchard is ap Richard, and a lot of things like Probert is ap Robert. And so Powell was originally ap Howell, and you have to think of like Old King Cole, Hole, ap Hole, and the original Welsh would have been Owell. And admittedly, that's not the way most people pronounce it. But as a genealogist and as a kind of somebody who valued his Welsh heritage, I think that was the point he was making with that.
Right. Any last comments that folks want to offer? Of course, we'll meet again in April, be talking about Acceptance World, which is interesting in its own way as we see the characters and their interaction develop. And of course, the highlight there, hope this isn't a spoiler. I'm not a big believer in let's avoid spoilers, but so if that's a problem for you, so be it. But we have the affair with Jean, which is a big part in Nicholas's emotional development in the course of time. So Sherwood Smith has a hand raised. Did you want to offer a comment before we wrap it up?
Super fast. I could be completely wrong, especially since
I'm sorry, you're really breaking up.
Through, but Whitmore reads to me much less. Whitmore reads to me less like a narcissist than like a highly functioning, super bright, always a bit off step socially. And so he has had to learn to observe people to figure what comes more naturally to others. And because his abruptness, simmering anger is life. Wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Okay, I think the comment was essentially he's not a narcissist, and I would agree. I don't see him as a narcissist, but he is definitely an outsider who works his way to the inside, patiently, because it takes years for him to reach to a point where he's able to essentially have power as opposed to seek power to be given to him by others. Terrific discussion, everybody. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for joining us. It's been great. And you're certainly
Thanks.
welcome to come back anytime.
Okay.
And everyone, let's continue. Happy reading. And if there's anything you'd like to see in particular on the site, I try not to do a lot because there's so many good things on the Pole Society website that I don't think it much needs to be duplicated. But it's all here to help the group. And we'll see you back in April. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.